Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating guest. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Hi, I'm Bernardo Ferdman. I'm here in San Diego, California at my home office, and it's great to be here with you. I've lived in San Diego for about 31 years. I'm originally from Argentina, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my background, but what I am is the principal and founder of Ferdman Consulting, and we specialize in working with organizations and leaders to bring inclusion to life. Well, my passion is to really create a more just and inclusive world where more of us can really be ourselves and do things that matter and really make a better world together with our differences without having to suppress important identities. And a lot of that comes from who I am and what my background is. I was born in Argentina, as I mentioned, 65 years ago. I came to the US as a 7-year-old, so English is my second language. I lived in New York, in Queens, New York for a few years, and then moved to Puerto Rico. So I had to learn a new kind of Spanish, different pronunciation of English, had to adapt really by learning new languages, new accents, being with different kinds of people, moving from public to private school, for example. And then went to high school in Puerto Rico. And then I moved back to the States, to the Northeast for college and graduate school. I studied psychology. First as an undergraduate at Princeton University, where I really dove into experimental social psychology, and then moved to Yale University, where I got a PhD in psychology. And I spent most of my career not only consulting, but also as a professor. I was a full-time academic for almost 32 years. And I taught first at the University of Albany, State University of New York, in psychology and Latin American and Caribbean studies, and then moved to San Diego in 1993 to teach at the California School of Professional Psychology, where I worked with graduate students, chaired dissertations, did writing and research and scholarship, and of course taught many courses. One of my specializations has always been diversity in organizations. That's really my passion. That's what I taught for many years. And I've been consulting in the field since the 80s, working with all kinds of organizations to, like I said, to bring inclusion to life, to really understand what are the mindsets, the behaviors and types of interactions, the norms in groups, the policies and practices and systems that we need to really create cultures and communities where we can really be ourselves, to grow into our best selves, to really make differences that matter and to sustain and nourish our many different identities. Anyway, I'm happy. Oh, and just personally, I'm married to a woman from Argentina yesterday who I met the first time I went back in 1989. In fact, yesterday we celebrated 35 years since we met and since we've been together. And we have 3 wonderful kids. They're not kids anymore. They're all in their 20s, and one is older, already into the 30s. And really proud of them. And so I want to tell you a little bit more about my my what I did in my career, what's happened over the years. As I mentioned, in graduate school, I studied psychology with an emphasis on social psychology, and I was very interested in identity, in the complexity of our identity, and in intergroup relations. How do we engage across groups, across differences? I was writing about that back in the 80s, continued to do that over time. Also, at the end of the 80s, when I started being a professor, I connected with Frederick Miller of the Khalil Jamison Consulting Group and Judith Katz, and I joined their firm as a associate consultant, as a part-time consultant, while I was an assistant professor. And so I really learned. I continued to do applied work that way. I learned a lot about working with different kinds of organizations and really assessing, strategizing, and really working from an organization development perspective to create groups and organizations where we really bring out the best in each other in ways that don't require us to suppress who we are. And so since then, I've worked with my own firm, Ferdman Consulting, and now I'm working with many, many different kinds of organizations. In 2017, at the end of 2017, I became a full-time consultant. I was always doing it part-time, but at the end of 2017, I left California School of Professional Psychology. I rose through the academic ranks and eventually was a distinguished professor. I was very involved in many societies. At one point, I was president of the Inter-American Society of Psychology. So I learned a lot about different kinds of psychology across the Americas, got to work with psychologists from throughout North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. And that was very important in my own development. And also have been very involved in the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. I'm a fellow of that society. I'm a fellow of the Society for Consulting Psychology, which kindly awarded me their award for diversity and inclusion consulting. Let's see, what else can I tell you about? Basically, since 2017, I've had the privilege of working with all kinds of organizations, corporations, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, international organizations, educational institutions. And what I love to do is work with senior leaders, leaders at all levels, to really help them develop their own perspectives and their behaviors and their approaches to inclusive leadership, and think about how to embed that in the organization through policies and practices. I've published a few books. The last two are edited books focusing on inclusion. In 2014, I came out with a book co-edited with Barbara Dean called Diversity at Work, The Practice of Inclusion. And there we really talked about how inclusion is very much a systemic practice, which really functions at multiple levels. It's about what we experience as individuals in our contexts. Are we feeling like we're valued, engaged, supported, safe, psychologically and physically, able to really be ourselves and not have to suppress valued identity so we could bring our contributions to the collective? I talked about in there in another level what's happening in our interactions with other people. Are we behaving in ways that promote that experience of inclusion for ourselves and others? In our groups, what are our agreements? What are our norms? What are ways that we do things that allow for differences to flourish and to become a benefit to everyone? Do we hear different ideas? Do we check in with people? Do we not keep people who have been marginalized in the external world in that same situation in the group? Do we counteract that and create more equity and inclusion for everyone across all many different kinds of categories of identity? What's happening in the organization? What are the systems and policies and values and goals? And how much does diversity and inclusion tie into the strategy, to the mission, to the vision and values of the organization? And then what's happening in the larger community or society? What are the ideologies and values? And what's the relationship of all of these? That's the fundamental of the systemic model of inclusion that I put forth in my chapter of Diversity at Work, the Practice of Inclusion. And then in 2021, I came out with another edited book called Inclusive Leadership, Transforming Diverse Lives, Organizations, and Societies. And that was co-edited with Janine Prime and Ron Riggio. And in that book, we have many different authors, about 47 authors, 29 chapters, and we really provide a really in-depth view of inclusive leadership, what it takes, what's involved. But at its core, inclusive leadership is about bringing inclusion to life. It's what I talked about at the beginning. How do we see diversity as an advantage for our collectives? How much do we promote experiences of inclusion for everyone across many, many identities? How much do we really allow everyone across identities to have a chance to direct, to speak up, to play an important role in the collective and make a difference for what we're building together? And how much do we promote equity and social justice? To me, those are fundamental components of this work. And so inclusive leadership is really about bringing all that together and fostering organizations where everyone can experience inclusion.
Wow, Bernardo, it sounds to me like you have dedicated your life to this work. Absolutely wonderful to meet somebody who is so committed to celebrating our diversity. So let's talk a little bit about your passion for inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
What sparked your passion for creating inclusive workplaces and societies? And how has this passion evolved over your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it is rooted in the experiences that I talked about a little bit. The idea of being a 7-year-old trying to make my way as a not speaking English and yet in a sink or swim approach in the English speaking schools of Queens, New York. And in the 1966, just trying to figure my way, trying to learn English, trying to figure out how to do simple things like hold a baseball bat, but they taught me how to do it right-handed, and I'm left-handed. Nobody stopped to ask me, what was I left-handed or not? And so, I was not a very good batter because of that, because I wasn't given the perspective, the tools, the way to do it that was adjusted to me. So that's a small example, but I also noticed other people. It was a time of a lot of immigration to the United States from Latin America, from Africa. And I remember as a child thinking about what was happening with other kids. I saw other kids who came after me being somewhat aggressive or not knowing how to communicate. And I remember thinking, wow, it must be because of their experience, how they're treated. It's not something inherent in them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, just noticing all of that, moving again and really adjusting to a new place and new kinds of identities and seeing those differences, just experiencing what it was like as, going to a Jewish camp one summer. I'm Jewish as well, and so I've been in a minority always. So in Argentina, in the US, among American Jews, I'm a Latino, so I'm different. In
Oh, wow.
Argentina, I'm Jewish, and so I was, in a Roman Catholic country. So, that sense of being on seeing things as an outsider, insider, is really part of what I learned. It gives me a certain power. And through my own perspectives on that, I developed my ideas about identity, that it's nuanced. It's not just one thing. I really don't think that it's helpful to think about identity as completely categorical. Yes,
Yeah.
it's real. We are different in different groups. It's different to be Australian or to be South African or to be American, all of these things. There's differences. If I go to Japan, I need to understand what is Japanese culture like and how is it different or similar to what I'm used to. However, I can't make assumptions about every single Japanese person or I'm going to be in trouble. How
Yes.
do we do both? And that's been the way that my own background has developed, has allowed me to see that lens and to develop it. So that's what I've developed in my theories, in my scholarship, in my writing and speaking, and in my applied work, really helping people explore the range of our identities and how they show up and how they affect each other. And the other piece of that is really an appreciative approach. How can we think about not just oppression and discrimination, which are real, but how can we then think about what else we want to create? None of us have ever lived in a world where there isn't racism, where there isn't sexism, where there isn't heterosexism. So what would it be like? We have to imagine that together and really create that image of a possibility for the future. And that's another driver for me of how I approach this work.
I love it. So, how has your background in organizational psychology influenced your approach to diversity and inclusion in consulting?
Yeah, I think some of it is what I've just been talking about, which is not to make it either or, but to
Yes.
really think about both and. How do we hold opposites? One of the things I learned very early on was this idea of paradox, for example, in group dynamics. I had professors who were really writing about that and teaching us. And so I really learned to think about how two things that feel like opposites can actually be two sides of the same coin. So
Mm-hmm.
when we look at identity, it's kind of like that. We're part of a group or also individuals. How do we hold both of those at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
We're part of many groups. And so I developed theories and perspectives on identity. I've written about Latino, Latina, Latinx identity along with my colleague Placia Gallegos. We have a whole theory about Latino identity development in the context of the racial dichotomy of the United States. Um, I really think as a psychologist, I think having a psychological perspective is very important, and also organization development, really thinking about people in the context of groups and systems, and how do we understand that in a systematic way, and also finally evidence, thinking about what does the research show, what is our working theory, and what are theories that have some support for them in the evidence. There's a lot of work in this field that is simply, just a few ideas, which are great. I think we need to get ideas from everywhere. But what I love
Yeah.
about psychological approach is the solidity of our training in measurement, in assessment, in in really thinking systemically and using tying all of that together for change, for
Mm.
positive.
So, in your extensive experience, what key factors make leadership development and organizational consulting effective in fostering inclusivity?
I think I want to highlight a few things for that briefly. I think
Mhm.
most critical is to take a systemic view. I think one and done approaches are unlikely to make a real difference, especially not a long lasting one. If we just go in and do a 2 hour training or even a 2 day training, I don't think it's going to be that effective. And evidence suggests that that's the case. It wears off. Um, so we need to think, how does learning and development fit into a larger system? What are the other pieces of the system and how are they aligned or not aligned towards our goals? So training is definitely not enough.
Yeah.
Also, we need to think very clearly about what creates and sustains change in a particular situation. And I think a key part of really making it work is having involvement of members of the organization. I really focus on trying to create inclusion here and now in whatever I do, to
Mhm.
model it as much as I can, maybe sometimes imperfectly, but I think it's so important to do that. And to help people then think about what are we doing and then how can we take that into the future? How can we develop agency or the idea of possibility for each person? Even as the system is not changing so much, how can each of us do something to bring more inclusion into our lives and those of others? And then how can we scale that up to the whole organization? And vice versa, how do we have organizational goals translated into everyday kinds of actions and imperatives and accountabilities?
Yes. So, as the editor of Inclusive Leadership Transforming Diverse Lives, Workplaces, and Societies, can you share a few pivotal insights from this work?
Yeah, of course. I think one of them is that inclusive leadership is absolutely critical for organizations in the 21st century. I
Mm,
described earlier a little bit what I mean by inclusive leadership, but I think it really
yes.
it involves fostering and sustaining an inclusive culture in different kinds of settings. And so it's beyond managing diversity to create environments where everybody can contribute at their best without hiding their identities. And so that's really critical if we're really going to get, the talent we need to address the problems that face us now and in the
Yeah.
future. We need diverse talent, and we need to promote equity and fairness.
Mm,
That's number one. It's critical to have inclusive leadership. Number two is inclusive leaders have a really important role in making a difference in creating safety, belonging, participation, and voice. Right? To bring everyone's talent, people have to be more flexible. They have to accept difference. They have to give individual consideration to people while they also promote collaboration. We have to have shared decision making. We have to build trust, and we have to build consensus. And so leaders themselves have to learn to be authentic and self-aware and be able to balance complexity and paradox and live with that. And then just one or two more, I think another one is, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of inclusion, it's a multi-layered construct. So I already talked about that, and inclusive leaders need to understand that and be able to work at all those different levels. And then we have to look at the barriers. Inclusive leadership involves noticing and addressing the barriers to inclusion. There's still substantial barriers. There's patterns of inequality and equity that are not sometimes obvious and sometimes not so obvious. I
yeah.
just recently read the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which also there's a movie directed by Ava DuVernay based on that called Origin. And it highlights how some of these systems are so embedded that we just take it to be the natural order of things. And that's the problem. And so we have to, inclusive leadership involves really trying to uncover that, to lift up marginalized voices, to notice biases and to question policies and to really display what Ron Heifetz called adaptive leadership, to help all of us move into a new place. And then finally, it's about the behavior that inclusive leaders show. We're not going to get into the details, but the point is there's very specific things that inclusive leaders can do to foster inclusion. And so really taking that in, practicing that, and sustaining those behaviors is really important. So I think the book details a lot of that in my chapter and many other chapters.
Okay. So what are the core elements of inclusion at work program? And how does it aid in learning about inclusion?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. Inclusion at Work program is an online learning program that I developed that's on the platform of an organization called Cognition that specializes in sustainable behavioral change. And so what we do is I created all the content, and basically it's a self-paced online program where people develop what I would say is agency, a sense of understanding and possibility around inclusion, to develop a deeper sense of self and one's own connection to inclusion. What does it mean? What can I do about it? It's really a coaching approach driven by powerful questions. So instead of just being lectured at, I mostly ask questions. My avatar is asking questions, and then people respond in it's encrypted so no one can see what people write. It's kind of like almost like journaling, but a guided kind of journaling, a Socratic kind of method. And so there's 8 learning guides, what we call COGs or coaching guides, and 4 assessments where people can compare the ideally inclusive organization to their own and see what are one's own behaviors in an ideal situation and currently. What are the leader's behaviors? What are ideally and currently? What are what are the work group's behaviors? And groups go through together in cohorts, and so they can share insights at the end of each COG. Those are shared socially, and kind of like in social media, you can like or comment, and so it creates a conversation. And so it's really useful as a companion to in-person or asynchronous work, so that people can really get an understanding. And then when they come together, they don't have to do the typical quote-unquote training thing, but rather can just dive into like, okay, what do we do with this? How do we co-create more inclusive work group organization world together?
So what strategies do you find most effective in developing and implementing DEI initiatives in organizations?
Yeah, I think I'll give you the very brief version. Basically, we need a systemic organization development kind of approach. So it's not a linear process, but there is a kind of flow to it. I think first it's about building the foundation, really getting senior leader engagement, developing a vision and rationale, building some momentum through some level setting, identifying key staff as change agents, maybe creating a working group, a steering group, refining that vision. Doing an assessment is really important. Prioritizing, setting the strategy, having a strategic plan for DI, one that's created with key members of the organization, with input from a needs assessment, from a conclusion assessment. And then thinking about what are the metrics as well, and then developing, implementing that work plan, and making sure that it's baked in so that we have accountability, monitoring, integration, and some guiding principles to align everything with ongoing learning throughout.
So let's talk about the challenges in multicultural leadership. What are some of the common challenges that leaders face in multicultural and Latino, Latina, Latinx contexts, and how can they be addressed?
Okay, and we want to do that in 30 seconds, right? That's a long process, but I think the headline I would say about that is managing the tensions of being oneself and also adapting. That is a key thing that is a challenge, because how can we all have to adapt to any kind of interaction in a group setting. But those of us who come from a minoritized backgrounds, who are not like the dominant or main groups, have had to adapt in ways that other people don't notice. When I'm speaking English right now, people may not realize that I'm very comfortable in Spanish, and I had to learn English as a 7-year-old. So So the challenge for leaders is, how can I be authentic and make my way in the organization? How can I be seen as both an individual, as a powerful individual with capacity and skills, and also have my background and identity acknowledged and honored? And then also recognizing and addressing the unique barriers that are particular to, specific groups or configure, intersections of group identities.
So
So we
how
need
do
spaces. Oh, sorry. Okay, we can leave that for another time. More detail.
So how do you approach the assessment and measurement of inclusion within organizations?
Yeah, that's good. I mentioned the importance of doing that earlier. I have my own measure called the Workplace Inclusion Inventory, where it focuses on the experience of inclusion, people's feelings of belonging, voice, of fairness, equity, work group behavior, one's own behavior, supervisor behavior, and perceptions of the organization's approach and commitment. And so I also have open-ended and demographic variables. And that instrument becomes part of a more comprehensive assessment where we do focus groups and interviews and really try to see what are the themes of what's happening. How does experience vary across groups? How does this connect to the strategy of the organization? So I think that's my approach. There's many, of course, but I don't believe in norming so much, because people, if we have 80% feeling included, is that enough? I don't think so. I think if one person feels like their voice doesn't matter, we need to pay attention to that, or at least understand why that is. So it has to be a collaborative process as well, as part of an organization development strategy or approach.
Fantastic. So what are your key recommendations for integrating and empowering Latino, Latina, Latinx employees in the workplace?
Well, as I didn't say a lot about my focus on that before, but it has been a specialty area to really work with Latino leaders and Latino leadership development. And I think what I've learned is that one of the key recommendations is to recognize, to give recognition to people, to the group, to really, a lot of Latinos are used to assimilating, to blending in, right? That's been the way that some of us have made it. And it's interesting because there's a racial component. Latinos who are more African descent are less likely to be included as much. So there's definitely, we have to address the racism that's implicit, embedded in many of our systems. So that's a key part as well. But a lot of it is listening and connecting, a back and forth dialogue, and creating spaces where Latino people can support each other, right? Like the employee resource groups, for example. And this is true not just for Latinos, but it's particularly helpful. And also making sure to address the diversity within. There's not one homogeneous group. It's many different kinds of people with different histories and backgrounds. So those I would see are the highlights of the approaches.
I love it. So based on your extensive experience and insights, what future trends or developments do you foresee in the field of inclusive leadership and DEI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're in a challenging time right now. There's a lot of pushback on these initiatives. And I think we have to understand that inclusive leadership is leadership, and leadership, to be effective and powerful, has to be inclusive. And so it's not about politics. It's not about, what we believe that way. It's about how do we really develop human potential to address our problems together. And without inclusion, it's not going to happen. DEI is so fundamental to our organizations and to our world. And so because of that, it's core to leadership. Leadership that doesn't consider difference and inclusion is not going to be effective, I don't think, for the problems we need to address together.
Yeah. I'm going to throw in a question here that wasn't on my list.
Sure.
So we are watching what is going on in the United States from a distance. It actually feels like the US is going backwards in this space. A lot of organizations are doing away with their DEI programs. A lot of white people are feeling threatened. What is the solution? What do you see as a solution for the United States?
I wish I had the magic. That's a 64 billion or $1 trillion question. But I think continuing the course, staying the course on this work, understanding that it's not about politics. That, having hope, I think, is really important. I've been doing this work for 38 years, and there are times when it's exhausting and tiring. But I think what I've seen over time is that we're kind of going around in circles occasionally, but we are making progress. There's a lot of things that are true now that were not true back, 25 years ago. The focus on people with disabilities, the focus on LGBT plus and inclusion, people's understanding that there's really a range of identities that we need to address, neurodiversity. And so the more people are involved, we realize that diversity and inclusion is really about everyone. There's still a lot of work to do, particularly around racism and sexism, some of the old things that have been there for millennia, but or hundreds of years at least in the case of racism. But I think I have a lot of hope that we can address it. I can't answer for the whole United States, but I think if many of us have that and continue to work on it and do it in a way that it really sees not what we're doing now as well as the future, I think there's the possibility that we can turn it around. But yeah, it's very hard at the moment in many cases. But when we're actually doing the work in organizations, you see what energy it brings out. You see how important it is to people, and that's what I think keeps a lot of us going.
And the George Floyd incident really ignited something else. From my perspective, it feels like the United States had a wound, a septic sore. During the civil rights movement, somebody slapped a Band-Aid on it and said everything is fine. And it's been festering underneath the fiber of the society for years. And that incident took the Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
I feel that it's an opportunity for the whole society to go into that wound and help clean it up and help it heal in some way. I'm just using this analogy because a lot of things get swept under the carpet. Issues are addressed at one point in history and you think it's fine, but it really isn't.
Absolutely. I think the killing, the assassination, the murder of George Floyd really, and I like to call it for what it is. People just use it as a verb. I think it's important to remember it was one of many. You can talk about Trayvon Martin, that had a huge effect on me as well as so many other people when Trayvon Martin was killed. Tamir Rice. Michael, in Mississippi, in Missouri. There's so many names that we could name, right? Breonna in Louisville, Kentucky. Anyway, I'm not going to give all the names, but the point is that there's so many people that have been unjustly and attacked and murdered in many cases. But people are living under the gun, and that's been true in this continent, in this country. And you're right, people finally saw it, and there are people that really were not noticing it suddenly realized, oh, wow. But of course, there's been a backlash and a retrenchment. I think it's uncomfortable to stay in that place all the time because it has to jar us out of our complacency. And most of us, and myself included, we want some normality. We want to be comfortable in our nice homes if we have lucky enough to have them, and with our everyday lives. And it's very hard to say that it's built on a foundation of injustice. And in so many cases that is, every time we use one of those land acknowledgements, if we really talked about it, it would be a lot harder if we really understood what that meant. And so, but it's not easy to just go back on it, to say, oh, we're just going to go back to what had true 400, 500 years ago, because that wasn't great either. I hope most people don't want that. So I think we need to create a new possibilities and really use this opportunity, not just to talk about the injustices, but to say, what would be just? What would be a great kind of world where everybody's included, right? And we're going to have to manage some tensions and some dilemmas. It's not going to be that easy. It's going to be uncomfortable and challenging. And I'm hopeful that we can do that.
No, Bernardo, there's a lot of work still to be done. Thank you so much for coming online and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us this morning.
Thank you.
Really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for this opportunity. I hope what I said makes sense, and I hope it's inspiring to some people. And if I touched one or two people and they bring it forward, then I'll be very, very pleased.
And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is a platform that brings you the stories and voices of people from all over the world. We share our stories to empower you, energize you, and empower you. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And Bernardo, thanks again for the interview.
Thank you.
Bye for now, everybody. That's a wrap, everybody. on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely